if you want to take the more optimistic take on this, or benign take, China as a latecomer to the world of diplomacy has few friends that it can find that haven't already had relationships. So they build relationships with countries like Zimbabwe or Sudan or Burma. At the same time, I think there is, to some degree, although not like openly, a desire to build relations in countries where the United States bilateral relationship is faltering. And this doesn't include only really difficult nations like Zimbabwe or Burma. A good example is the Philippines. A couple years ago, the Philippines and the United States had a somewhat rocky patch in their relations, partly because the Philippines pulled troops out of Iraq for a whole series of complex reasons. And at that time, the Chinese stepped in and very aggressively cultivated the Philippine government. Just to skip to the bottom here, though, I don't think that that means that China has a strategy to benefit from the United States failure, or to definitely stick their thumb in the eye of the United States. China recognizes that its relationship with the United States is very, very important. So, though it cultivates some of these countries, you see that when other countries make very stridently anti-American statements or really seek to use China as a weapon against the U.S., China backs off quite significantly. A good example of this is Venezuela. China has built a very good relationship with Venezuela in recent years. Hugo Chavez obviously has got not a whole lot of love for the United States, and he's also prone to make quite wild statements. And on several occasions when Hugo Chavez has made very stridently anti-American statements while in Beijing, the Chinese ambassador in Venezuela has been very explicit in calling to the local media and saying, we do not want to associate ourselves with those statements. We do not associate with those statements. So there's a very high degree of pragmatism. Just one other element I think that is interesting and that I've talked to U.S. officials about a lot. With the U.S. often perceived increasingly as unilateral in the world, China has in some ways stepped into this void. China's become kind of born-again multilateralist. China is often the country that interacts with multilateral groups around the world, multilateral regional groups. And I think sad to say to some extent from a U.S. perspective, China is often the country whose officials hit the road and put the face time in that's necessary for diplomacy. I did a study of the amount of time that officials who would be considered cabinet level in China spent visiting several Southeast Asian countries in 2004 and 2005. And it was roughly twice the number as U.S. officials of cabinet rank. And what this means is not necessarily that you get so much benefit only from having the Secretary of State going somewhere, but just that you get benefit by having anyone of cabinet rank, anyone of significant rank, showing the kind of face time necessary for diplomacy. I just briefly want to look at kind of, as China's become more engaged in the world, why? What are the goals? Why does China need to become more engaged with developing countries? Clearly, access to resources is very, very important. China's gone from becoming a net producer of oil and gas to, within a few years, becoming the world's largest importer of oil and gas. And the Chinese leadership realized that they're desperately dependent on few suppliers, far too few. And one of the critical aspects of their diplomacy has been to look at places that they can get new sources of oil, gas, and other resources. And they particularly need to look at places where there isn't already significant Western or Japanese investment. So this takes you to Sudan or Angola or other places where there isn't so much competition. Also, Chinese companies are beginning to invest out in the world for the first time. Again, they're looking at places where they can compete, where there isn't necessarily so much to compete with competition from big Western companies. So why are Chinese companies building hotels in Sierra Leone, which you wouldn't necessarily think of as the most attractive environment for investment? Because no one else is building hotels in Sierra Leone. Why are they invested in Liberia? Similar reasons. Reducing Taiwan's influence in long-standing Chinese goals hasn't changed in the last few years. Japan also, I think, there is at least implicitly a desire by the Chinese to reduce Japan's influence in Asia. I think the two most important are, very interestingly, I think have our understanding in Beijing in recent years that if China is going to become a bigger international actor in Africa and Asia and other parts of the developing world, it needs to be perceived more benignly. It has to reduce fears dating back to the 90s of China's economic competitiveness, that China is going to be problematic for a country's local domestic manufacturing industries, textile industries, things like that. That changing the global image of China is critical for China to become a more significant international player. And finally, I don't know that I necessarily agree with this, but one point that's been raised quite a lot in the at least in Southeast Asia, whether China sees this region as a sort of natural sphere of influence, the way the United States, a long time ago, before the United States was really much of a player in the world, enunciated the Western Hemisphere with our sphere. At least I think, to some extent, in the long term, China sees itself as a natural co-leader of East Asia along with the United States. What I really tried to focus on in the book was spending a lot of time on the ground, traveling around places where China's influence has grown, and looking at specifically how they do it and how it compares to the US or France or Japan. And so as China's strategy globally has become more sophisticated, they also have more sophisticated tools of influence. Perhaps the most important, particularly in Africa, is that China now has a very substantial aid program. It tends to be somewhat opaque, but it's very substantial. In Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, Burma, in Laos, and Cambodia, China's aid, loans and grants now vastly outstrips the US. In many countries in Africa, China has become the most significant lender in Angola, Zimbabwe, and many other places. But what's interesting about this aid is that if you think back to the 50s and 60s, China used to give out a lot of aid, and you remember perhaps that they gave out a lot of aid for big buildings, structures, infrastructure. Sports stadiums was the famous thing that China spent money on. And I think it's, of course, debatable. Sports stadiums have some relevance. I'm not against sports. But today the aid is much more sophisticated. It's not built just for structures, but it's built to increase people-to-people contacts, which is quite a dramatic change. China has its own Peace Corps type program that sends volunteers out to Ethiopia and Laos and Burma for people to do projects. Has informal cultural and business summits. Has programs to bring people on visitor programs, just the way the State Department has. This is a very, very dramatic change. And then this is backed up by much more skilled formal diplomacy. You see this all over the world. You see this in the U.S. Recently with this series of many stories about tainted foods, tainted products, tainted toys from China. 10 or 15 years ago, I think the Chinese embassy in Washington and Chinese officials would have not responded at all. Now, although there's, I think, a debate about how they should respond, you do have a very significant media response. You have people calling press conferences to talk about what they're going to do to clean up the tainted foods and tainted toys and other tainted products. Whether they actually will is, of course, a different point, but PR doesn't necessarily go hand-in-hand with reality on anyone's side. But just in general, over the last 15 years, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China has spent a lot of time essentially cashiering older diplomats. A generation of people who tended to come from either the Maoist era or the Cultural Revolution era, when a lot of the best minds in China were lost to the diplomatic corps. From that time, unfortunately, not necessarily always the best and brightest. And replacing them with often younger people who are now pushed to return to the same country over and over, learn local languages, and learn English. So you now have a generation of Chinese diplomats who are far more skilled in English, more likely to deal with local media, and often speak local languages as well. The example I often give is Thailand, which is a country I've lived in for years and know well. 10 years ago when I lived in Thailand, the Chinese ambassador was invisible. As a journalist, you would have no access to him, and he would basically never appear in public. I mean, he appeared, but he never appeared in the news. And now, Thailand has a program that's a little bit like Larry King Live. It's kind of like an informal nighttime chat program where you can talk about politics, but also get personal. And the Chinese ambassador appears on that program. He speaks well, he speaks quite openly, and he speaks excellent Thai. Part of this outreach also has been a substantial promotion of Chinese culture and language. So that can be on the high level. China has established the Confucius Institute project, which is a project to spend 1 or 2 years, to provide 1 or 2 years of funding for Chinese studies at universities around the globe. In poorer countries, it often tends to be spending money on primary schools. So, for example, in Cambodia, spending money on Chinese language primary schools, which often are quite competitive or better than local Cambodian schools. And then helping students who have good marks in those go on to China with scholarships. Again, I think it's instructive that this is a recognition of the need to build a broader appeal, not just with top leaders. And it has to some extent been successful, so that the number of overseas students studying in China has grown from about 8,000 15 or 20 years ago to about 120, 130,000 today.